Democritus. So Democritus was a pupil of certain Magian and Chaldeans. He traveled to Egypt to learn geometry from the priests as well as Persia, and it's said that he associated with the Gymnosophists of India.
Ah,
Gymnosophists, also known as the naked philosophers or
yeah.
naked wise men. This was the name given by the Greeks to certain ancient Indian philosophers of an ascetic orientation, meaning they held to a lifestyle characterized by abstinence from sensual pleasures, often for the purpose of pursuing spiritual goals. There were gymnosophists in Upper Egypt who were called Ethiopian gymnosophists as well. Um, so his accuracy of observations were marveled at by Hippocrates. Um, and he was also a contemporary of Hippocrates who had conversed with him directly. Democritus was an admirer of Pythagoras, and it appears that he drew a lot of inspiration from him. So, yeah, go ahead, Ike, and feel free to add anything additional about Democritus. And then I wanted to ask you particularly about Magians or Magianism or the Magi, because I think it's very direct to the overall theme here. Like who were the Magians? What were their sort of practices and their religious lives like? And how it kind of compares or differs with the Chaldeans. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, Democritus was obviously pre-Socratic, so before Socrates, before that dialectic. That's really what, a big part of Socratic philosophy embodies is the dialectic method, um, which is this kind of discursive reasoning, a reasoned argument or discussion between two or more people. And that we see that right in Plato's dialogues. That's exactly what they are. That's the way he taught. That wasn't always the case, right? Because you get people, you have other philosophers, right? Mathematics was kind of was part and parcel of philosophy, right? Because Sophia was wisdom, and so people like Euclid and Eudoxus writing philosophically, mathematically, but not necessarily always in a dialectic or discursive um sort of way. And that's what we see with Socratic philosophy along with these really rarefied ideals. So the pre-Socratic philosophers were like natural philosophers more so. Not they were there's a lot of discussion of cosmogony, which is interesting, the formation of the cosmos and then how that relates to how does this big machine work. It was like a bunch of people who just, it was something from the Twilight Zone. A bunch of people who are just sort of waking up in this realizing we're in this gigantic machine. How does this work? What is this? That was really pre-Socratic philosophy. Whereas Socratic philosophy dealt with things like virtue, ethics. Okay, we have ideas now about how this thing works, but how do we live in it? You know, what's the telos, the meaning, the purpose of this whole thing? That seems that's much more so Socratic philosophy. But Democritus was interesting. He developed the idea of the atom, atoma meaning unbreakable in Greek. So people think that a lot of these ideas are really new. Oh man, I'm forgetting the philosopher's name, but I mean, it was like I think in like the 300s BCE, there was a Greek philosopher, Eratosthenes.
Hmm.
That's him. Eratosthenes. He calculated the circumference of the Earth within like a margin of like a fraction.
Wow.
So it's like people think like, oh no, they thought the earth was flat. It's like, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. You're dumber than they were. Because you believe that fucking tripe. Like these Greek philosophers, they knew the earth was a globe based off of the Particularly like the eclipse when the Earth cast a shadow on the moon, or they knew that, oh, it's round, it must be a globe, like these fucking oranges or something like that, and obviously there were a lot of other calculations, but Democritus, right? So we're talking about early pre-Socratic kind of natural philosophy. They're kind of proto-scientists, and Democritus was really interesting. He basically says that he talks about how the smallest unit of matter is this unbreakable monad, this globe. It's the perfect shape. Everything wants to be circular, because that mirrors infinity. It's the perfect shape. But the thing is, even though those particles, these atoma, they were physically indivisible, there was space between them, which we know to be true. So he conceptualized it as like an infinite amount of space. Again, Sajasic, presaging, our discovery of like what we would consider 0 point, the 0 point phenomenon in like quantum physics, where it's like we understand that there's space between these molecules, but every time we try to measure it, every device we have just keeps going into infinity. And when you think of it that way, right, if every single atom is surrounded by space, some sort of, we don't really say that it's a vacuum, but it's space. We don't really know how to describe it. If that's the case, right, and that is kind of infinite, then we're made more of nothing than of something, which is which is really, really crazy to think about, and it really, it's very pertinent. It points to the illusion of materiality, really. What we understand now in that kind of that 0 point, quantum physics level, is that there's this kind of chaos here with the subatomic particles exist there. They kind of come in and out of reality through that space, quarks and neutrinos and things like that, and they don't behave rationally, which was again presaged in ancient Greece by the discovery of non-rational numbers, irrational fractions and things like that, which was like an abomination to them. It destroyed the precious order of their philosophy. But it's essentially he attempts this problem because there are these paradoxes that certain other philosophers put forth, that they were like, okay, they're trying to figure out whether or not, and this is crazy, but not crazy, but it's just wild that they thought this deeply and this intensely back then. Whereas now, like, most people are just, they can barely think. People can barely think now.
You got their 10-second TikTok vids.
Yeah, I see it happening to me. My attention span's getting cut up because I'm always on fucking social media. It's much harder for me now, having been on social media steadily for the past year, to pay attention to anything. But these philosophers, there was a paradox, and I forget who put it forth, but they were trying to figure out if movement is actually possible.
Mm-hmm.
If movement is real. Or if it was illusory. But these are kind of things that we're still wrapping our heads around from a quantum level, from a philosophical level. We haven't really answered these to any degree of satisfaction. We've gotten really good at a particular type of investigation, or I would say data interpretation, and that's data that we get from technology. We have highly refined technological instruments that are giving us data, and yeah, we could synthesize that, we could kind of make sense of that, but it doesn't disprove the existence of the other stuff, right? The metaphysical, the non-sensible. We just don't have the instruments to examine that as minutely. as the instruments we have developed for material science. I mean, it can be said that really things like meditation, scrying, vision work, astral work, those are all technologies, right? Because to investigate something that is non-physical, you need non-physical things. You need a non-physical technology. Really, it's a technique. Um, but so that, I mean, that's really what I know about Democritus.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and so he was a pupil of the Magians. And so what does it mean to be a pupil? Does that mean
student,
what was that?
a student. That's all.
Student. Okay.
It's a synonym for student.
What can we say about the Magians? It says Magians and the Chaldeans. So I don't know, are Magians separate than Chaldeans? Are they what's the difference between them as far as maybe you're concerned or your knowledge is concerned?
So it boils down to etymology and really time period. For a really long time, Chaldean, Persian, Sumerian, Akkadian, Mesopotamian, Babylonian, Iranian, they were nearly synonymous terms. People just threw them the fuck around like they meant the same thing. They're different cultures that existed sort of co-terminally. uh or they existed successively in various at various times. So really, whether or not I'm talking about Chaldeans or Assyrio-Babylonians is just what time period am I looking at? Because they all kind of lived in and around, those empires were around what we would consider modern day Iran,
Mm.
that area. You know, ancient Babylon, that's Iran right now. And the Chaldeans were, I'm pretty sure they were the oldest. Uh, they were the sort of, I think it was Mesopotamian, uh, Chaldean. Um, well, there was Sumer that was very old, and before them were the Akkadians.
So they had things like the Chaldean oracles,
Yeah,
obviously.
but the thing is, what you got to remember about that is that the Chaldean oracles were written by um the Giuliani
Mm.
supposedly. And they, Julian the theurgist and Julian the Chaldean. So we don't really know very much about, and that was because that's the Hellenistic era.
Hmm.
It's not, we're not going back into ancient
Okay.
time. This is mid to late antiquity we're talking about here, because we don't have the original Chaldean oracles anymore.
Mm.
What we have extracts of Plotinus, Porphyry, Proclus, the Neoplatonists, what they wrote and said and quoted, and things that related to theurgy and theoria and all kind of this hodgepodge at this point of Neoplatonic sayings. And we call that the Chaldean oracles, but we have no idea what the actual Chaldean oracles were as a whole document. We have
Mm.
fragments and extracts. It's like if I'm quoting from the mystical Kabbalah, but nobody, they have my 4 or 5 lines of what I wrote, but the book's not available. So we don't really know. But the thing is that they were early in the system of transmission. It's the Mesopotamian astrologers were practicing this 5,000 years ago. They were practicing astrology back then. It was, you know, omenic, and it was mundane, astrology. It was electional. It had more to do with the affairs of state and sovereign, um, and omens,
Mm.
and also, but not, this wasn't like people on the street. You know,
Yeah, yeah.
these were priests. These were priest astronomers. And that's essentially what Magi means,
Mm.
priests. That term, I believe, comes from Old Phoenician. Um, and I'm sure it has etymological roots in uh even further back. And the
Yeah.
thing that's really, really interesting that a lot of people don't realize, and Stephen Flowers has done some really interesting work on this. You have the ancient um I want to say Sumerian cultures and their gods. And this would have been, I believe, contemporaneous with like Abraham in the Bible, right? He left the city of Ur, which was a Sumerian city. They have their pantheons of gods and goddesses and things like this. And then comes the prophet, uh, down the line, Zoroaster, Zarathustra, and he essentially takes what was considered, I guess, as a barbarous polytheistic religion, and he turns it into more of a dualistic religion that contains within it not merely this um, set of cosmogonical and cosmological myths and formula for worship and tribute of various gods, but a soteriology, a study of salvation. Um, and that is very interesting because really, I mean, it's at this time in Zoroastrianism that we find, I think,
Hmm.
the highest uh the most refined version of priesthood and magic, really. There's a lot of magic that come out of the Avestas, which
Mm.
are the old sacred texts of that land. And the really, really interesting thing is that the Avestas share a lot of etymological root, and they use common words that you don't really find in other areas, as the Vedas. It even sounds like it. Avesta, Veda.
Yeah.
It's the Indian scriptures, the precursors of what we call Hinduism, really Sanatana Dharma, the eternal Dharma, that Buddhism comes out of is a new reinterpretation of. I would say that Zoroaster did for or Zarathustra did for that religion, that area, Buddha did for the Far East.
Yeah.
Um, so it's Magi was traditionally a word, or Magos was traditionally reserved for a priest class. And now you find, where do we don't really know 100% the etymology, or somebody might, but the issue is that we have a really hard time communicating with the historical and academic authorities in Iran, right? It's not like you can just go over there. It's not like London. Um, uh, so they keep a really tight, lid on availability to those ancient sites. Things are from people like us. And so, I mean, we look at the bombing of Baghdad, right? It destroyed tons of artifacts from,
Yeah.
from,
And then
from that era and that area.
I think there's like the library of Ashurbanipal. I think that was in that area, a big ass library.
Yeah.
Um, and just on,
But
sorry,
but
go
but
ahead.
I just wanna point out that because they share so many similarities, there's something interesting. Where do we find, like, in that language, in Hindi and Sanskrita, and the language of the Vedas, we find like the prefix ma, meaning great, and we find go, or gos. Um, we find that meaning two things: how, or like light. So it's interesting because if you take the Vedic associations of those two, this compound word, let's say, and put them together, you have a word that means great light.
Mm,
And we also know, that the cow became a sacred animal anyway. But It's these were the men learned in the astronomical sciences in that culture in Phoenicia, and they're the Persians, you know,
Yeah.
it's the same area, you know. So it's so yeah, so that's kind of the what the word magos means, and it's essentially what we're talking about, these natural philosophers, right? Because they didn't really use astrology the way that we use astrology. They used it like looking at the universal clockwork to say,
Mm.
okay, now is the time to, you know, go to war, or now
Yeah.
is the time to plant the crops, or now is the time to build this city, lay the cornerstone of this building. It wasn't like they weren't reading natal charts. They weren't doing horoscopes.
Yeah, and just to touch more on the note of like the Omenic observations, Jamie Paul Lamb was telling me basically like in regards to all of the Omonic data that was collected over these large periods of time, in particular that we're talking about, like with the Chaldeans and whatnot, is kind of what led largely to the understanding of things like the virtues and the dynamics of astrological and astronomical associations and influences and how they have their effects on consciousness and matter in the material world and on earth by all of these years and years of collecting all of this data on the things that occurred in regards to the times that the planets were at certain positions and and all of these recorded data sets. When you look at all of them, you find these particular patterns, and in finding and looking at those particular patterns is where such a large portion of what we now modern day understand about why, why do we say things like Venus is associated with particular things like love or, Venusian aspects. Is because of this preemptive, very like in-depth data that was from this Omenic kind of observe these like Omenic observations or
Yeah,
whatever.
no. I mean, observation is the best. That's the best word. That was the closest you could get to scientific experiment was back then was observation. Observation is part of the scientific method still, right? You have to observe something so that you can say, okay, either we agree or we disagree. It happened this way, and then it happened again this way. Right? Repeatable empirical evidence in order to confirm a hypothesis as a theory. So yeah, I mean, these were the first scientists, but it wasn't, they were the first scientists and the first philosophers, them and the Egyptians. The Egyptian, the pre, and who the fuck knows? I'm not going into Atlantis and all these Hyperborea. I don't care about any of that shit. Because I mean that at that point, it's like there is zero historical record. I'm not saying that it didn't exist. It's just, that's not something that we can really talk about without getting into like, what somebody's grandma in the 1700s fucking channeled in a graveyard. We
Yeah.
have no idea. There's no way to know. Drop it, because we get out into these weird places. But at the end of the day, we do see, we're getting more information about the ancient Mesopotamians and Sumerians and Syro-Babylonians, Akkadians, all that stuff. There's more stuff coming in. There's been a little bit of a surge in scholarship. I remember maybe like 5 years ago, I remember seeing I don't remember where though. Might have been on television, but it might also have been like a YouTube video. I can't remember. But there were certain academics calling for more interest in
Mm.
like this scholarly trajectory. Like we need more archaeologists, we need more historians, we need more qualified academic professionals to specifically focus on this area. And
Yeah.
we've seen more and more of that stuff coming to light. And so we can really see that these priests, they were scientists at the same time, scientists, philosophers, and holy men, and because it was all one fucking thing. When you look at the universe, when you look at creation as inherently miraculous, it's all then you don't philosophy, spirituality, and observing nature. It's all the same thing.
100%. All right, so then we got, I want to make sure I pronounce this right. Is it Empedocles? Emped
Empedocles,
Empedocles.
yeah.
Empedocles. So Empedocles, he was said to be of the Homeric school. Maybe you can first just elaborate a little bit on the Homeric school and what that all entails. Um, I know, like, Homer, he was a pupil of Anaxandrus and Pythagoras. So what was
Homer,
the Homeric school of things? Like, is that just mean like studying things like the Iliad and the Odyssey and the epic poems and whatnot?
to be honest with you, I'm unaware as to whether or not it was a distinct philosophical school or
Hmm.
whether it was um so back then, right? Omeros means blind. That's what that means.
Mm.
And I've always had this, like since I was like 15, I've always had this kind of pet theory that Omeros, um, it wasn't a person. It
Mm.
was a group of people because they were historians, and all histories of old were part legend.
Yeah.
Because you that's the whole thing, right? It constantly goes back to what I always say, and with what a lot of people, right? Because I didn't discover this. I heard it from somebody else, applied it to my life, and it was like I'm seeing things that have always been there that I've never noticed before. And it's this whole idea that we have in place from the time we are born a deeply, deeply, deeply programmed system of uh, nominalism, this intellectual dualism where it's got to either be this or got to either be that, you know, and highly Aristotelian, but it's never this or that. It's always this and that, and then probably more. Right? We
Definitely.
just talking about how philosophy, religion, math, science, they were all one fucking thing. And that's why these people were able to be at the same time philosophers, holy men, live those lives of constant purity and devotion and ministering to various gods, and at the same time studying science, studying mathematics, living polymaths. They were, I mean, this was apex
Hmm.
because they didn't bifurcate and fucking compartmentalize. They were chopping up our minds in the modern day.
Definitely.
So it's like even back then, histories had to teach lessons. They had to teach morality. They encoded esoteric truths. They recorded a story of what happened and the greater moral or spiritual implication, right? You read the Iliad and the Odyssey, it's just full of the fucking gods. The gods are the only reason anything happens.
Yeah.
So I mean it's like the gods have, you know, uh they're just as prominent and prevalent as any human figures in those stories. And so I've always had this suspicion that Homeros was a tradition. It was a tradition like kind of like the Druids have the bards. Well, the ancient Greeks had the Homeros, the blind poets, because they never saw what happened. They weren't there. That it's been passed down with these epic poems that were sung to music. That's how you were able to memorize this stuff. Homeric stuff was poetic. It required music, typically. So I'm unaware as to a specific philosophical Homeric school, but if I had to guess, I would say Empedocles um, maybe studied this way of weaving legend, history, myth, spirituality, all of those things into the Homeric whole, so to
Mm.
speak. These are my little pet theories. I'm not saying that you should go and now, okay, start saying this is how it was. This is just
Yeah.
my theories. But I do know that Empedocles was very, very important because he devised the theory of all matter being composed of four elements. And that's where we get, earth, water, air, and fire. Those are traditionally known as the Empedoclean elements.
Yeah, and that what you said makes total sense. Makes a lot of sense to me. So yeah, he was of, at least that school or that line of inquiry for one. He was said to perform magical feats, particularly in the realm of healing. He was a great healer, apparently. It seems, healing and purification was very important to him, as well as a lot of these guys that we're going to be talking about. He was a champion of freedom and adverse to rule of every kind. He was apparently very humble and declined kingship that was offered to him at one point. So those are some kind of interesting little noteworthy things about Empedocles. Is there anything else you wanted to add about him before we move on?
I just want to say that the guy that does not want to be king is always the one who should be.
100%.
That's about it.
I'm with you on that.
Yeah.
All right. So then we got Pythagoras of Samos. He was said to have started the philosophy of Italy, whatever that means. I'll ask you about that.
Yeah.
Uh, seems like a very broad stroke, but yeah, we'll talk about it. So he was big on the practice of silence, and it was required for his disciples to undergo 5 years of silence, mainly listening to his discourses without seeing him, and then only after passing an examination they were admitted to his house and allowed to see him. Then after learning to keep their peace and to hear, they were allowed to speak and question and write about their conceptions. He was very big on memory work, and this sort of reminded me of things along the lines of Saint Ignatius of Iola, because it was said that a Pythagorean didn't rise out of bed until he had gone over the actions of the past day
Yes.
in consecutive order, and then if they were availed more leisure, they were to recollect all events of the past 3 days. It was believed nothing was more conducive to silence, experience, and prudence than to remember things. It was said that he had morning excitations at his house, composing his own soul to the lyre, singing songs of Thales, as well as Homeric verses, and used dance, of which he attributed to agility and bodily health. He had these verses that everyone was to repeat to himself prior to sleep. Um, so the verses that go like this, at least the English translations, uh, quote, "Nor suffer sleep at night to close thine eyes, till thrice thy acts that day thou hast our earn. Thou hast our un. How slipped, what deeds, what duty left undone. And before rising, as soon as thou wakest, in order lay the actions to be done that following day."
Yeah,
So,
so that right there was lifted from Pythagoras.
mhm.
At least, right, it's attributed to him.
Yeah.
The most important thing that you could say about Pythagoras is that he never wrote anything. So all we have is from his students and what we suppose is attributable to him and his school. But like you're saying, to your point, Saint Ignatius of Loyola, who founded the Jesuits, that is in his foundational text, the spiritual exercises. And that's actually one of the most well known of his spiritual exercises. And it's lifted from the Pythagorean school.
Yeah. What's it called again? There's like a particular name for it. Like, is it the Ruach or something, or the Rickshaw or something? Rickshaw
I don't
practice
know.
or something.
I I don't know. I think a rickshaw is like a little cart that you get pulled around in.
I might have that completely wrong. But yeah, I wanted to ask you. So he is of Samos. So Samos, is that related to things like Samo-Thracian mysteries?
Yes.
Okay, that's cool. Yeah, I didn't make that connection until I was reading.
Samos is an island, and Thraki is, Thrace they call it, but it's Thraki. That was the mysteries of the Kabiri were celebrated there.
Oh,
But the thing, yeah. So Pythagoras is really interesting. It's always been very interesting to me that, you know, named after a snake. right?
Python?
Well, in Greek, the word for snake is Pythia.
Mm.
So, because it's almost like an onomatopoeia, that's that sound that a snake makes. But yeah, Pythia, but then also the Pythian priestess,
Oh,
the
okay.
temple to Apollo was oracular.
Whoa,
She
okay.
was she was an oracle, the Pythoness, the Pythian priestess, um, or the temple to Pythian Apollo at Delphi, and so these things are related. The that penetrating kind of knowledge, we always see that, right? Even when Christ admonished his followers to be ye wise as serpents, right? He's the word he uses there is phronimoi, wise. That's more of a shrewdness. It's less of a wise that we think of like a wise old man who's going to tell you about spirituality. It's more like the guy that's like, you know, um go to will tell you how to stop being more practically foolish, the kind of guy that would tell you, okay, no, that's penny wise and dollar foolish. It's more of a practical kind of application. Shrewd, be ye as shrewd as serpents. And then also you have in the Bible, right? I mean, the tempter is the serpent, but it's tempting. What he's not tempting them to, like, oh, this fruit is good, but it's going to go straight to your thighs. No, that's not the temptation. Is like, you will know, you will come into the knowledge of good and of evil, and so we constantly see the snake, right? And the oracle, right? She knows the future. And Pythagoras, this who would be, it was foretold. Yeah, I think it was in De Vita Pythagoras, by Iamblichus, where he told it could have Porphyry wrote one about him too. I'm pretty sure. But that might have been Plotinus. But anyway, Iamblichus, at least we attribute the main biography that we get from Pythagoras to Iamblichus, who wrote about him. And I'm pretty sure in there it recounts this tale that it was told to his mother that this would be one of the wisest men to walk the earth. She names him after the python, the snake,
Wow.
Pythagoras. But it's this is I mean, Pythagoras is one of we don't know anything about really. You talked about, but that's and I said this to Michael Osborne recently. I spoke to him last week for the podcast, and we were talking about Pasquale, and I was talking about how I fall in love with these people that it's
Yeah.
like impossible to know anything about,
Yes.
because the mystery just draws you in, and that is very much so. Pythagoras's life was a mystery. We kind of know maybe around what time he was born. We kind of maybe know around what time he dies. We don't know where his body lays. He never wrote anything, so we don't have a single thing. Like, we can point to these, the Platonic dialogues, at least most of them, and say, okay, Plato wrote this. We can't do that with Pythagoras.
Yeah.
Um, and so a lot of it comes from his students. And the interesting thing is that Iamblichus also says, it might have been Porphyry. I'm going back and forth on this because Porphyry also wrote a biography of Plotinus. So I get confused of whether both of them wrote biographies of Plotinus, or whether both of them wrote biographies of Pythagoras. It's fucking confused. Too many Greeks. but
Those Greeks, man.
we multiply, but we all look exactly the same. No, but it's we have, I'm pretty sure it's Porphyry. Porphyry, yes, absolutely, it's Porphyry. So Porphyry also wrote a biography of Pythagoras, but he wrote and he said he spent 22 years in the temples of Egypt, astronomizing, geometrizing, and being initiated in no superficial or casual way into the mysteries of the gods there. So it's attested, right? That happens to Plato, right? We have it attested that Plato studied under the Horite priests named Seknufis for I think 7 years. And we even find in I think it's the Phaedrus, that we have either Phaedrus or Parmenides, but Plato talks about the Egyptian god Thoth, writing, see, this great scribe god who invented numbers and letters and words. So you have Plato talking about the knowledge of that god, and what he did and why it's important. And so you have all these guys getting initiated in Egypt, but after Pythagoras comes back, right? And the quintessential thing that defines all these guys is this initiatic experience. They are changed. They don't go there. It's not like going away to college, because they're coming back talking about they're not discussing the Tao. I mean, like the NASDAQ. They're not talking about like mundane horse shit. They go there and they come back talking about the fucking wheelwork of the universe. So it's way more than just this vocational training. These men are being taught. What is being installed into their brain is like a gigantic kind of like cleaver that just like a something that just wedges itself into your brain and opens and expands your mind. And drugs can do that for like a night, but they're being trained. What's happening really that we find is that they become the first methodological thinkers. They have a method, they have a logic, they have Solon, Thales, all of these guys, the lawgiver, the father, Thales, the father of logic. It's attested they all went to Egypt and learned this stuff. And they come back with these methods. And so really what it is it's they're, like I said before, we have this sort of postmodern interface. It's like software installed into our hardware. So it's like, yeah, we all have the same hardware, but we're running this fucking software it's making us perceive things in a very, very particular way. And so ours is restrictive, 100% restrictive. Theirs was expansive. They're being installed with this perceptive interface that allows them to see penetratingly into the telos, into the occult, right? The things hidden from the eye, oculus, occult, occultus, hidden from the eye specifically, that you cannot see. Why does it rain when it does this? Why does heat act this way? What's going on? And so they discovered these things. They became very, very good at creating these methods for investigating nature that became highly, highly logical, particularly by the time of Porphyry and Aristotle, the great empiricist. But that they also, as they tended down and looked inward, they also looked upward. And we find the best example of that in the historical record, for my money, in Plato, because he's not just talking about the physical. He's constantly referring back to the metaphysical, the higher. And he did really exist in a ultimately Pythagorean tradition of doing that. Pythagoras changed philosophy forever, forever. It was like we were going this way, and here we are now because of Pythagoras. And again, blending mathematics with the spiritual, right? Because mathematics, it's very important to note, mathematics is miraculous, and we didn't invent it. We discovered or began to observe patterns. We created the symbols we use to communicate about this pattern that actually exists everywhere. But the thing is, philosophically, in ancient Greece, there was this big argument over what is real. What is real, and how do we define real, and what is illusory? And the real, it was boiled down to, particularly in a Platonic sense, is whatever doesn't change is real. Everything else, because it changes, it falls apart, it dies, it decays, it can't be real. real being synonymous with eternal. What is this? We know that all this shit it can't be, it's too weird. It's, it has this underlying pattern. Sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't. What is it? It's got to be fake. To some degree, it has to be illusory. Every major spiritual tradition that has ever existed has said that. Whether it's the Soma paradox of Plato, or whether it's the veil of Maya, or of Mara, the enemy of Buddha, who was materiality. But they basically come to this idea that what is real is what is eternal, what doesn't change. And mathematics doesn't change. That pattern does not change. If I go to China, if I go to Texas, it's going to be a different time there than it is here. If I go really far north to Alaska or Iceland, it's going to be, more hours of darkness. It'd be like 19, 20 hours of darkness there. If I go to the moon, I'm going to weigh less. I won't be able to move as fast, but no matter where the fuck I go, 2 + 2 will always equal 4. That's called a mathematical universal certainty. So what we can say about those principles is they are in some way reflective of the eternal, and they're the only reality that we can physically comprehend. True reality. And this is what Pythagoras is known for. And then Plato develops it in his ideals, the realm of forms, which is basically synonymous, equated to the Platonic forms, right? The 5 Platonic solids, the only regular geometrical solids that can be created. And now we're into geometry, and geometry is how mathematics takes on a third dimension, right? That's math creating the physical universe, is geometry.
Yeah. I wonder if Pythagoras's mother knew that he was on a trajectory to undergo this sort of initiatic lifestyle in Egypt, given that selected name for him, named after like a wise snake. It just seems very um fit for his
I
character.
I, I don't I personally, I'm not convinced that he was born with that name. We don't
I
know
I
anything.
I would lean towards that with you as well.
Yeah, I feel like that would be a name that he took on. You
Mm,
find that a lot about with particularly with initiates. People who are initiated take on new names,
mm,
different names. Plato, that's not his fucking name.
yeah.
But that wasn't his name. Um shit, I forget his name. Uh, well, in any event, Platonos means wide. You
Mm,
know, that's what that word means. His name was wide. And we have that recorded for all time. But that was not his birth name.
yeah, wow. Do you have any insight into how you would say in Greek, nor suffer sleep at night to close thine eyes till thrice thy acts that day thou hast o'ern, how slipped what deeds, what duty left
Oh no,
undone?
no way. No way.
All right. Yeah, it's a different, it's a more ancient Greek that it would have been spoken in, right?
I would just say Pama hypno, go to sleep. Go to sleep.
Cool. Um, and then so did we talk? Yeah, what would be considered the philosophy of Italy? I guess he started the philosophy of Italy.
The thing is that you got to understand is that Italy was not Italy until
Mm-hmm.
I think the 18 or 1900s. The same thing with it's a similar kind of thing with Germany. There's all these like little kingdoms and things, not unified. It wasn't a country like that. And so Italy in the in I want to say, I can't pinpoint it exactly, but I know in antiquity for several hundred years Italy was known as now I'm talking about, in the days of the Greek philosophers. I'm not talking about the Middle Ages or even at the time of Rome, before Rome. It was called Magna Graecia, Greater Greece,
Okay.
because it's just where, right? Greece is mostly islands, you know. So it's like there's Sicily right there. There's Malta, there's all sorts of stuff. I believe it's the Adriatic Sea that they share, not just the Mediterranean. The ocean between the western coast of Greece and the eastern coast of Italy is the Adriatic Sea. So there was a lot of movement, and that's all that people have this mistake. They think that Greece was like, we are Greeks and it's our country. Greek was two things. Greek was a language, and Greek was a certain style of I want to say municipal government or infrastructure, right? The polis, the city state. So that was what Greek was. It wasn't like ethnicity like this. You know what I mean? It was there weren't, thousands of years of just these people being in this area. We're Greeks. Here are our borders. It was all sorts of things. Yeah, the Peloponnesian Wars, Athens and Sparta hated each other. They could only unite to fight the Persians. So it's not like the way people don't have any historical kind of context.
Mm.
So Greek was a language. Parts of Ephesus, that's modern day Turkey. That was Greek. You go right. People talk about Alexander the Great in Macedonia. That was Greek. Man, it's not Greek anymore. You know what I'm saying? It's the culture was Greek.
Hmm.
So it wasn't really like that. So, and they were a seafaring people. They moved around constantly, but on water, right? Because it's very hard to travel through to places from the Peloponnesian, and you have to. It's very arid, it's very rocky, and it's extremely mountainous.
Mm.
So it's not easy to travel. It's easier to travel by boat, which is what they did. Um, and so yeah, they traded with the Italics and the Latins. These people, early people, the Etruscans. These were the early precursors of the Italian peoples. The Etruscans were in the area of where Rome is now. They called it Etruria, and they learned a lot. Their language developed almost. They had a lot of contact with Greek traders coming up and down the rivers there, right? The river Tiber and Tevere, and so their language was developed in intercourse with trade, with the Latins people and the Italic people and the Greeks. There's a lot of Greek in Latin. The Latin of Rome, a lot of Greek, a lot
Mm.
of similar words, shared words, loan words. So when with all that in mind, when Pythagoras comes back from Egypt, he starts his school in a seaside town in what we call modern day Italy, which was then Magna Graecia, Greater Greece, a little town on the southeastern shore of Italy called Crotona. And so he basically starts philosophy there in Crotona. He starts his school. He starts teaching people all this stuff that you said. He had the sort of auditores, these people who took a vow of silence had to just listen to him for years. That all that stuff was going on in Italy. That was going on in his school in Crotona. He didn't do that in Greece.
Mm.
So what happens is then, right, the myth is, or the legend is, that they took him for a wizard and burned him to death. And they burned him like inside his home, he had a compound where everybody lived. And they set that on fire one night and he died. But the thing is, you look at like I had a conversation with David Pantano about, when Italy became Hesperia, the Star of the West. Um and You had people also like in the Italic Hermetic tradition, like Giuliano Cramer's.
Mm.
Cramer's, what he had people that attested to him as, and I don't know if he ever said it himself, but you had people who were inferring that this man uh is during that time, right, the late 19th century, uh he was one of the last, or for their time period, the most contemporaneous expression of what they called the Pythagorean philosophy, which had existed underground in initiatic schools in Italy since the time of Pythagoras. Now,
Wow.
do we have paperwork? Of course not. That's not how these things work. But I would even say that you look at um, the Greek traditions, the Neoplatonic traditions, the Platonic traditions, the Hermetic traditions, which was Greco-Egyptian, that came out of Florence after Cosimo de' Medici and his men find these texts, and then Marsilio Ficino translates them, and then he starts with Gemistus Plethon, the New Platonic Academy, and he has this little meeting. He has his villa that Cosimo buys for him. This little sort of vacation home uh, in a outside of a place called Careggi, and he has all these he does these rituals, and he does the Orphic hymns. His nickname among his group of associates was Orpheus, because he could play music very well. He could play the lute and these, and so he would set all these things to the hymns to music, and he would prescribe them to people like medicine. Like a doctor would prescribe medicine, he would prescribe Orphic hymns. And he did all this Greek translation work in this Platonic Neo-Pythagorean philosophy. And then you have, years later, the Aurum Solis, which is the Ogdoadic tradition, and they claim descent from the magicians, quote unquote, and scholars of the Careggi circle.